At 02:15 in the morning, somewhere west of Luzon, the Pacific looked calm enough to pray over. Beneath that calm, 3 American submarines were about to rewrite naval history, and then be told it never happened. By dawn, 17 enemy ships would vanish, and when the captain sent their reports home, Washington called them liars. The water was black and flat. The sky showed only a thin band of stars. The night had that heavy quiet sailors remember for the rest of their lives. On the USS Parche, red lamps glowed in the control room. Men spoke in low voices. They breathed through the stale, warm air and watched the needles. No one wasted a word. Commander Lawson, red Ramage, stood over the chart. He tracked bearings with a pencil that left small dents in the paper. He was calm. He was careful. He was the kind of captain whose crew trusted the silence between his orders. Intelligence said a Japanese convoy was moving north. Tankers, transports, 2, maybe 3 destroyers. If true, it was a gift and a grave at the same time. A faint echo came through the headphones. Then another. The sonar man pressed the cups harder to his ears. Multiple screws. Bearing 130. He kept his voice flat, almost bored, so his fear would not spread. The helmsman nudged the bow to starboard. The boat slid like a shadow under deeper water. Far to the east, 2 other American subs were creeping in on the same course, Steelhead and Hammerhead. There was no radio talk. Radio gave you away. The only thing they shared was training, a sense of time, and the hope that the ocean would not turn against them. The convoy arrived as a line of heartbeats on the sonar paper. 2 fast contacts up front, several slower ones behind. It filled the headphones like a slow drum. Ramage didn't rush. He watched, waited, and let the targets reveal their pattern. The worst mistake in a night attack is hurry. Patience is a weapon, too. Searchlights swept the horizon. Not for the Americans, yet, but for discipline. The convoy did not know death was already inside its lanes. Ramage raised the periscope for a 5-second slice of the world. Black water, a huge dark shape crossing left to right. Another behind it. He lowered the scope and spoke in a steady voice. Solution coming. Standby tubes 1 through 4. A minute stretched long. The torpedoman watched the repeaters. The boat trimmed a little nose down. The bearings steadied. Ramage nodded once. Fire 1, fire 2. Fire 3. A hiss. A small kick, then quiet. On a sub, the loudest sound is waiting. The first hit arrived as a heavy thud that the hull carried into every bone. Oil leapt from the sea and caught fire. A tanker rolled and began to burn like a torch laid flat. The second hit came almost on top of it. Somewhere beyond, men shouted in a language the Americans could not hear but understood anyway. Downscope. Take her deep. The Parche slid under the shock in the boiling water. Depth charges tumbled in a pattern the crew already knew by heart. 5, then 7, then 9. The first set was too far. The second walked closer. The third found the right distance but not the right depth. The hull shuddered. A gauge flickered. Someone whispered a prayer and then bit it off. After 20 minutes, the ocean calmed. Ramage rose to periscope depth again. What he saw belonged to some other kind of night. Fire on the sea. Ships crossing each other's wakes. An escort turning too hard and almost cutting a freighter in half. The convoy had lost its shape. That is when a good captain stays. He does not claim the miracle and run. He makes the miracle finish its job. At 03:10, the Parche fired again. 2 more hits. A transport broke its back and folded like a book. Farther north, Hammerhead found the stragglers. Steelhead worked the outside lane and threw a spread at 2 tankers hiding behind smoke. One after another, the ships slowed and went dark. The ocean took them without a word. By first light, the count was beyond reason. 17 ships, oil burning on a line that looked like dawn trying to rise from the water. 3 American subs, low on air and battery, watched the smoke drift and did the only thing they could do. They logged the bearings. They marked the time. They turned away. They did not cheer. They checked leaks, wiped grease from their hands, and counted the remaining torpedoes. Victory in a submarine is quiet work. You do not climb a mast and wave a flag. You breathe, you wait. You hope the next sound you hear is your own engine and not a weapon falling toward you. Ramage stared through the scope one last time. He saw wreckage and small boats and a large hole in the sea where oil had burned itself to sleep. He said it almost in a whisper to no one in particular. They're not going to believe this. Then he had the scope lowered and ordered a slow turn for deep water. The message home was simple and exact. Positions, times, estimated tonnage. observed sinkings, secondary explosions. It did not brag. It did not guess. It spoke like the sea, flat, cold, precise. Headquarters read the report and paused. Then they read it again. The numbers were too high. The timing too tight. The staff officers had seen errors before. They had seen men count the same ship twice in the heat of battle. They had seen torpedoes that seemed to hit but did not. They had seen bad intel grow into proud stories. They had also seen careers end on paperwork. A hand wrote the first line of doubt, unconfirmed. The crews slept in shifts as the engines pushed them east. It was the kind of sleep that you take in small pieces. You wake with the taste of diesel in your throat and salt on your lips. You hear the boat everywhere, in your ribs, in your teeth, in the way the bunk hums against your shoulder. No one dreams much on a sub. You store feelings for later, when there is time to feel them. When the Parche surfaced to charge batteries, the men watched the sky turn from black to gray and then to a weak blue. They ate fast, wiped coffee from their cups with rags and put the cups back on their hooks. A few wrote lines on small paper. Not letters, just notes to themselves. A list of ships. A thought about home. A joke they would tell if they ever found a bar in San Diego again. Steelhead sent her own report. Hammerhead did too. The numbers did not match exactly, but they lined up enough to make a shape HQ could not ignore. 3 separate accounts. The same night. The same destruction. 17 was not a number. It was a weight being lifted up in the dark by 3 sets of hands and held where men who were not there could see it. The answer back was careful. Claims noted. Await verification. Further detail requested. It did not say false. It did not say true. It said what offices say when the truth is bigger than the form they have to write it on. Ramage gathered his officers and read the message. No one complained. No one cursed. They had seen doubt before. You cannot hear courage on a radio circuit. You can only measure it by what remains when you turn the set off. He told the men the only thing a good captain can say in a moment like that. We did our job. We'll show them again if we have to. Night fell again. The ocean turned dark and level. The sub slid beneath it like a thought a man tries to keep to himself. There were still enemy ships out there. There were still escorts. There were still men on both sides who wanted to see morning. The crew set watches. The helmsman settled his hands on the wheel. The sonar man put the cups back over his ears. The boat made its sound, the low, steady beat that says alive. Back on land, the first cracks of doubt widened. A clerk ran the numbers through a conversion sheet and frowned. Another pulled a chart and put pins where the attacks were supposed to happen. The pins made a scatter of red that looked like blood spatter to a mind too tired to be poetic. An officer with a short temper asked for tonnage by class and shook his head when he didn't like what he heard. A commander who had never been depth-charged wrote excess claim in a margin and underlined it twice. The war did not pause to argue. Convoys kept moving. Planes kept lifting off. Submarines kept slipping into and out of the places where men drown without sound. But a story had started, and stories in war can help or harm as much as any weapon. Word spread. 3 subs one night. Too many sinkings to be real. Men who loved the idea smiled. Men who hated the idea sharpened their pencils. Ramage did what he always did. He hunted. He left the anger to the space between 2 breaths, and then he let it go. He studied the sea, the charts, the angles. He taught his crew to look for the small signs. A smudge of smoke below the horizon. A light where no light should be. A wake that runs the wrong way against the wind. He kept the men busy with the ordinary. Busy beats fear. Busy also beats pride. 2 nights later, the subs crossed the course of another small convoy. Nothing like the first. 3 ships, 1 escort. The kind of chance you take when the ocean gives it. The attack was clean and quiet. 1 ship sank. 1 was damaged. The escort ran in circles and dropped charges far behind. The Americans slipped away untouched. It would not change any minds in Washington, but it would remind the crews who they were. Men who did a job that makes no noise until the moment it does. Back at HQ, a young analyst with a clear mind and tired eyes pulled a set of intercepted radio messages from the Japanese side. They were fragmentary, times, grid squares, panic codes, fires, request assistance, am missing ship. I am missing many. He lined them up next to the American logs. The times did not match perfectly. They never do, but the shape returned. He circled 3 lines and wrote a question mark. He was not brave enough to write, "This looks real," but he was honest enough to call his boss over. The boss read the intercepts and felt a small turn in his gut. He did not smile. He did not rush to a phone. He simply moved the folder from the stack labeled Doubt to the stack labeled Hold. In 10 minutes, that small move would save the report from a stamp that would have erased it. Word drifted back to the boats that review continues. It was not good news. It was not bad news. It was the kind of sentence that makes a man want to put his fist through a bulkhead and then laugh at himself for being a child. Ramage read it, folded it, and put it in the log. He took the periscope and swept one circle of the sea. Empty water. He breathed once and set the scope down. The engines droned on. The crew ran drills. They checked valves. They cleaned the same things they had cleaned the day before. Every now and then a man would start to say 17 and then stop. The number did not feel like a medal anymore. It felt like a secret you tell and no one believes. That kind of secret eats at you if you let it. So they did not let it. In the wardroom, the XO made a list that no one asked for. Who had done what in those 2 hours of chaos? Not a list for medals. A list for memory. He wrote names. He wrote small acts that could be lost. The torpedoman who fixed a sticky door with a single sharp hit from his palm. The quartermaster who kept the plot book straight when the floor tried to throw him. The kid from Ohio who did not flinch when a charge went off so close his ears rang for a day. He put the list in an envelope and sealed it. He labeled it with the date and nothing else. Morning came again. The Pacific turned the color of steel. The sub took a long breath through its snorkel and then went back under. Men shaved with a few inches of water in a bowl. Someone found a slice of canned peach in the galley and cut it into 5 pieces and passed them down the line like a joke about rich men. No one asked for more. Back in Washington, the conversation turned from no to show me. That was progress. It did not feel like progress at sea, but it was. The office asked for more detail on explosion sounds, on ship silhouettes, on the order of hits, on bearing changes after each fire command, on fuel smoke versus ammo smoke. The questions were fair. They were also a test. Could the men who made war in darkness explain that war in daylight words? Ramage answered straight. He described the noise of an oil fire, low and heavy, versus the sharp crack of ammunition cooking off. He gave the lengths of masts he had glimpsed against firelight. He put times next to bearings and did not round in his favor. He left gaps where his memory had gaps. A lie can be smooth. The truth has edges. The analyst read the answers and felt the click that people feel when a story lines up with the way the world really works. He marked the margin with a small star, the kind clerks use when they want something to survive the next desk. He did not have the rank to declare the report true, but he gave it a path. The 3 subs kept hunting. They had done a thing that would echo for years, but echo or not, the ocean did not care. It wanted men to keep their discipline. It wanted them to watch the gauges and the clocks and the quiet that can kill you faster than any weapon. They did the work. That is what keeps you sane. Do the work. Let the rest sort itself out on land. Somewhere far behind them, oil still burned. Somewhere ahead, a new convoy was learning how to be afraid of the dark. Between those 2 places, a line of American steel moved just under the surface. It left almost no wake. It spoke in numbers and in looks and in orders that fit in a single breath. If you had been there, you would remember the feeling, not the words. The night that took 17 ships did not end when the sun rose. It stayed with the men who made it happen. It stayed with the men who refused to believe it. It stayed as a weight in both places until the day records would surface and maps would be redrawn, and the official line would catch up to what had already been true. But that is later. For now, the Pacific rolls on. The subs go quiet again. The men listen. The next sound will decide whether they live to send another message that someone on land will doubt, and then, maybe, finally learn to respect. By the time the submarines reached Pearl Harbor, the war had already moved on to other headlines. The crew stepped ashore pale and stiff from weeks underwater, expecting at least one handshake or debrief. Instead, clerks handed them forms. Every man had to write his version of the action report, positions, times, bearings, a map of what they had seen when the ocean burned. Commander Ramage filed his report first. He kept it simple. 17 confirmed sinkings, verified by sonar and visible explosions. He attached log entries and periscope sketches. He signed at the bottom, respectfully submitted. Then he waited. Days passed, no reply. Then a cable arrived from Washington. It contained 3 words: claims under review. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance could not accept numbers that large without proof. Every sinking had to be matched with intercepted enemy traffic, post-war photography, or captured documents. Until then, the victory was unconfirmed. The men tried to shrug it off, but the silence spread through the base like humidity. Other submarine crews asked careful questions in the mess hall. 17? All in one night? Ramage didn't answer. He'd been at sea too long to argue. The ocean didn't care about paperwork. The ocean remembered. 2 weeks later, Washington sent investigators. They wore khaki but not salt. They carried folders, not sidearms. They wanted details. Exact bearing when each torpedo fired, interval between detonations, identification of targets through periscope glass. The questions were clinical, and the tone colder than the ocean had ever been. Ramage sat through it without blinking. He described the scene the same way each time. A convoy in panic, ships colliding, fires rising like sunrise. When asked how he knew they had sunk, he said simply, "Because they weren't there when daylight came." The answer satisfied no one. They wanted coordinates, wreckage, witnesses. He had none. The officers from Steelhead and Hammerhead fared no better. Their reports matched in spirit but not in detail. One placed an explosion a mile east of the other's log. Another described a tanker where the third saw a transport. To bureaucrats, the small gaps meant exaggeration. To submariners, they were the natural fog of battle. It didn't matter. Doubt had found its mark. By October 1944, rumors reached the press desk of the Pacific Fleet. Overclaimed sinkings in the South China Sea. No story ran, but the whisper was enough. Medal recommendations froze. Ramage's name disappeared from the short list for promotion. Headquarters didn't accuse him of lying. They simply stopped calling. That was punishment enough. In his cabin one night, Ramage opened his notebook. He had written nothing for weeks. He turned to a clean page and wrote one line. "Truth waits longer underwater than ships do." Then he closed it and went back to work. The next morning, he drilled his crew like any other day. Discipline was the only defense left. Across the Pacific, intelligence officers sifted Japanese radio traffic for confirmation. They found fragments, panic messages, distress calls, but the Japanese Navy's code officers were masters at hiding loss. Many ships were struck from rosters with vague notes like "missing in typhoon." No one could prove that the storm had been American. When the war finally ended in 1945, the U.S. Navy released its official tonnage reports. The Parche was credited with fewer than half the sinkings claimed. The rest were marked unverified. A footnote explained, "Further evidence unavailable." It was the kind of sentence that erases months of fear and genius with one line of ink. The crew read it in silence. They didn't argue. They knew the truth lived somewhere 200 feet below the surface, where oil still leaked from broken hulls and drifted toward the light. But no one would ever dive that deep to check. War had moved on to new heroes, new numbers. Ramage retired quietly after the war. He never rewrote his report. He never changed a word. In interviews, when asked about that night, he only said, "We saw what we saw." Some believed him. Most nodded politely and turned the page. In 10 minutes, one of those old Japanese convoy logs, long thought lost, will surface in a post-war archive. And inside it, a list of 17 ships will carry the same dates, the same grid squares, and the same silence that once filled the headphones of 3 American submarines. The war ended before the argument did. When Japan surrendered, the Pacific filled with headlines about peace and victory. But for the submariners of that forgotten night, celebration felt thin. They stood in dress uniforms on the pier at Pearl Harbor and listened to the speeches, but the cheers belonged to other names. Theirs had slipped quietly from the record. Commander Ramage returned to Washington that fall. His uniform still fit, but his confidence no longer did. In the hallways of Navy headquarters, people nodded with the distant politeness reserved for men whose stories didn't line up. He sat through meetings where younger officers quoted official tonnage figures that carved his accomplishment in half. He didn't correct them. The men at the table had never smelled burned oil on black water or heard a ship break apart through sonar. They had their math. He had his memory. One afternoon, a clerk stopped him in the corridor with a sheaf of papers. "Commander," he said, "your commendation's been revised." Ramage thanked him, took the envelope, and didn't open it until he was back in his quarters. Inside, the language was clean and polite. Action resulted in multiple sinkings under hazardous conditions. Confirmed tonnage reduced per revised intelligence. The number that had once been 17 was now 6. He folded the paper twice and put it away. The same message reached the other captains, those of Steelhead and Hammerhead. One left the service soon after. The other accepted a desk job. None of them spoke publicly about the night again. For a long time, the ocean kept its silence too. In 1946, Navy historians began compiling the official chronicle of submarine operations. They worked from reports, not memories. Anything marked unverified went into the appendix or disappeared altogether. The editors needed clean totals, not disputed legends. One civilian researcher later admitted, "We weren't writing history. We were writing balance sheets." Ramage moved to New England and taught navigation at a maritime academy. He was a patient instructor, soft-spoken, steady, exact. His students admired how he could explain a compass drift or a current shift with the precision of someone who had once depended on it to live. But when they asked about the war, he changed the subject. He'd say, "Learn to read the sea. It tells the truth slower than men do." For almost 2 decades, the record stood as written. 6 sinkings. The rest, rumor. But history has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. In 1961, a Japanese researcher named Kenji Watanabe began collecting lost merchant logs for a maritime museum in Tokyo. Among the documents was a water-stained ledger recovered from a burned-out warehouse. The pages listed ship movements, convoys, losses. One section, dated the same night as the Parche's attack, carried 17 names, each with the same coordinates that Ramage had reported. Watanabe wrote to the U.S. Naval Historical Center. He received a polite acknowledgement and then nothing. It took 3 years and a meeting in Honolulu before anyone agreed to review his findings. When they did, the match was undeniable. Every entry, times, locations, even the order of ships lost, aligned with the American reports. The impossible night had happened exactly as described. But by then, almost everyone involved had retired. The Navy issued no press release, only a quiet amendment to an internal file. Ramage's commendation was restored to its original tonnage, though no one thought to tell him. When a young archivist finally reached out, he found that the old commander had passed away the year before. His wife accepted the letter and placed it next to the folded flag that already sat on their mantel. In the years that followed, a few journalists rediscovered the story. They called it the Night of 17 Ship, and their tone was half wonder, half apology. Veterans wrote in from across the country, saying they remembered hearing rumors during the war but were told to keep quiet. "Too big to be true," one man wrote. Turns out it was just big enough. Today, when historians list the most successful submarine actions of the Pacific War, the numbers include that night again, but the records can't capture the silence that followed it, the kind that settles between men who know what they did and a world that took a lifetime to believe them. In 10 minutes, one of those old attack maps, once buried in a cabinet labeled Disputed Claims, will be hung in a museum beside a photo of 3 calm-faced captains. No captions about vindication, no quotes, just a chart full of small red X's across a patch of the Western Pacific where, for a few hours, the ocean swallowed everything and gave back only disbelief. History doesn't move fast, it seeps. For almost 20 years, the Navy's official records held 2 versions of the same night. One, stamped and filed, listed 6 confirmed sinkings. The other lived in the memories of a few hundred sailors who had seen 17 ships go down and never found the words to make anyone believe it. By the early 1960s, that second version started to rise again. It began with a small note in a British naval journal, just a footnote in an article about Japanese merchant losses. The author, a civilian researcher named Douglas McIntyre, had compiled data from Tokyo's post-war archives. He listed several convoys lost in 1944, including one designated MI-11. According to the Japanese ledger, MI-11 ceased to exist after night engagement south of Formosa. No cause given, no survivors listed. The date matched the Parche's patrol log exactly. McIntyre mailed a copy to a colleague in Washington. Within weeks, the paper reached the Naval Historical Branch. A junior analyst read the line twice, circled it, and wrote in the margin, "Check against Parche, Steelhead, Hammerhead Ops." That small pencil mark reopened a file that had been cold for 2 decades. What followed was slow, patient detective work. Historians pulled Japanese convoy manifests, shipping insurance records, and survivor accounts from post-war trials. The pieces fit together like a puzzle left too long in a damp box, warped but still recognizably one picture. The 17 missing ships matched the same grid squares, times and tonnage the Americans had logged. The ocean's silence finally had coordinates. By 1964, the U.S. Navy quietly reclassified the reports. The correction appeared in a supplemental volume of combat narratives, Submarine Operations in the Pacific. It was 1 paragraph long. Subsequent examination of Japanese records confirms that the coordinated attack by USS Parche, USS Steelhead, and USS Hammerhead resulted in the destruction of 17 enemy vessels. Previous estimates understated the total. No ceremony, no press release, just a correction in print, as calm and understated as the men who had waited for it. But word spread anyway. Old crewmen received phone calls from historians, then letters from their children who had found the story in newspapers. Some had never spoken about that night to anyone, not even their families. Now they did, haltingly, as if the truth were too large to say out loud. A former sonar operator described the sound he could never forget, the way the convoy's propellers turned from rhythm to chaos, the long silence after each detonation. It was like hearing the ocean breathe differently, he said. Another sailor remembered the glow on the horizon, and how the captain told them to stay at battle stations even as the fires spread. He said the ocean will hold them now. The recognition came too late for most. Commander Ramage's name appeared once more in official records, but he had already been gone 5 years. The Navy sent a formal notice to his widow, acknowledging the full extent of his patrol's success. She read it at her kitchen table and said, he would have smiled, then gone back to his garden. For those still alive, the correction meant less about medals and more about memory. They had spent 20 years living with an unfinished story, and now it finally ended where it began, with quiet water and men doing their jobs. In 1968, a small reunion took place at a Veterans Hall in San Diego. The surviving officers from Steelhead and Hammerhead met for the first time since the war. They brought their old charts, still smudged with pencil and salt. Someone pinned a map of the South China Sea to the wall. They stood around it with beers in their hands and traced the convoy's path with their fingers. No speeches, no toasts, just nods. A journalist asked one of them what it felt like to be proven right after so many years. The man laughed. We were never wrong, he said. The paperwork just needed to catch up. Today, in the archives of the Naval History and Heritage Command, you can find both versions of the report, the early one that doubted and the later one that confirmed. The ink looks the same on both pages. What changed was belief. In 10 minutes, a curator preparing an exhibit on lost victories of the Pacific will slide those 2 pages side by side under glass. Visitors will see the difference, 6 ships on one, 17 on the other. And somewhere in the space between them lives the sound of the ocean that night. Steady, indifferent, eternal. Recognition came slowly, but it came. In 1972, the Navy organized a review of all submarine operations during World War II to mark the service's 30th anniversary. It was meant to be a ceremonial project, commemorative posters, speeches, and a few new plaques for bases across the Pacific. Instead, it became the moment when the night of 17 ships finally returned to daylight. A young historian named Lieutenant Commander Alan Reeves was assigned to the review. He had grown up listening to his father, a sonar technician, talk about the odd gaps in the war's official records. Reeves started reading every declassified patrol report he could find. When he reached the Parche file, he paused. The numbers didn't add up. 6 sinkings in one column, 17 in the captain's own handwriting below it. The contradiction pulled him in. He traced it backward through the paperwork. Revisions, annotations, the quiet bureaucratic edits that had erased half of an extraordinary night. Then he found the Japanese shipping logs that Watanabe had uncovered years earlier. The coordinates matched perfectly. Reeves realized that one of the most successful submarine attacks in U.S. history had been forgotten not by accident, but by the slow erosion of skepticism. He wrote a short internal memo recommending a formal correction. The evidence now available, he concluded, fully substantiates the operational claims of Commanders Ramage, Bordelon, and Childs. The results were not exaggeration. They were precision. His superiors approved without hesitation. They were men who had lived through the war and still carried respect for anyone who faced the Pacific in a steel tube. On May 14, 1973, the Navy issued an updated citation. For extraordinary heroism in action during the night of July 31, August 1, 1944, against enemy convoy Mi-11, the coordinated attack of USS Parche, USS Steelhead, and USS Hammerhead resulted in the confirmed destruction of 17 enemy vessels. Their conduct exemplifies the courage and skill of the United States submarine force. It was signed quietly. No cameras, no press. The document went out to the families first, then to the museums, then at last to the fleet. In New London, Connecticut, sailors at the submarine school heard the story during morning formation. A senior instructor read the citation aloud. The new recruits, kids barely 20, listened with the polite interest of people hearing about someone else's war. But when he reached the line and no one believed them, the crowd fell still. Every man who had ever sent a report up the chain knew what that felt like. One of the last surviving crewmen from the Parche, now in his 80s, was invited to attend a small ceremony at the base. He stood beside a model of the submarine, its paint flaking, its brass plaque dulled by years. Reporters asked him what it felt like to be vindicated after so long. He smiled faintly. "It's not about us," he said. "It's about learning to listen to the men who come back from the dark. They usually know what they saw." The following year, the Naval Academy added a case to its museum display on Pacific warfare. Inside it, under glass, were two maps, the official 1944 version and the corrected 1973 edition. Next to them, a simple card: "Truth takes time to surface." By the 1980s, naval historians began referring to the event as the convoy that vanished. Books, documentaries, and classroom lectures finally treated it as fact, not folklore. Yet the story carried a humility that set it apart from tales of medals and triumphs. It was never about glory. It was about belief, the invisible currency that holds armies together. For the sailors who had lived through that long silence, the recognition came as both relief and sadness. They had spent decades watching history forget them. Now, at last, it remembered. But many were gone, their memories preserved only in logbooks and letters. The ocean had claimed them as it had claimed the ships they sank. When Reeves visited the site of the original attack during a research voyage in the late 70s, he stood on the deck of a modern nuclear sub and looked out at the empty horizon. Somewhere beneath the waves, he knew, rested the remains of 17 ships that had once carried supplies, men, and hope for another empire. He raised his cap and said nothing. Silence felt more fitting than words. The sonar tech on duty that day later wrote in his journal, "When he took his hat off, the sea went quiet. It's like even the ocean remembered." In 10 minutes, the archivist back in Washington would prepare one last folder. Its label simple: verified. Inside, the reports that were once doubted, the memos that once erased them, and a single photograph of a calm sea west of Luzon. Because sometimes, vindication doesn't come with applause. It comes with a record finally put right, and the whisper of waves over the place where truth was once lost. The sea keeps what it wants. Even after the Navy corrected the record, the night of 17 ships slipped quietly back beneath the waves, folded into the larger memory of a war too vast for any one story to hold. But for those who still cared, the historians, the sons and daughters, the last submariners, it became something more than a tale of torpedoes and tonnage. It became a parable about belief. In the years that followed, young officers learned about the event in classrooms and simulator drills. Instructors used it as a lesson about discipline under doubt. Sometimes they said, "You'll know what you saw and the world won't. Do your job anyway." The cadets nodded, half understanding. Only later, when they faced their own storms of paperwork and skepticism, did the lesson find its weight. At sea, submariners began calling that moment of disbelief the Ramage Problem. It described the gap between truth and proof, the distance between a sailor's experience and the report that reaches a desk. The name caught on because every sailor had felt it in some form, the knowledge that what you live through can vanish if it doesn't fit someone else's chart. Naval historians kept searching for the convoy's remains. Technology caught up where memory had failed. In 1992, A deep ocean survey team scanning the South China Sea for lost wrecks found a scatter of large steel hulks at the exact coordinates listed in the Parche's log. Some lay in pairs, others in clusters. Sonar images showed twisted decks, torpedo holes, and the outlines of tankers still upright in the silt. The ocean floor had become a museum, silent and exact. When the images were shown to surviving crew families, many wept. Not out of pride, but out of recognition. One widow said, "It looks just like he described it. Fire everywhere, then nothing." For the first time, the physical evidence matched the human memory. The myth was gone. Only fact remained. That discovery gave the story a second life. Museums rebuilt their submarine exhibits to include the convoy strike. Veterans' halls held small screenings of documentaries. The footage showed sonar maps fading into the faces of men long gone. No narration, no music, just names and grid coordinates over the sound of water. It was enough. By then, the submarines themselves had changed beyond recognition. The old diesel-electric boats had given way to nuclear giants that could stay submerged for months, travel faster, and strike from half a world away. But in every captain's ready room, there hung the same photograph. The calm sea west of Luzon, Euro 2:15 a.m. Nothing but horizon and darkness. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "The ocean remembers even when we don't." Historians sometimes argue about why this particular story endured. There were bigger battles, louder victories, higher counts. But the night of 17 ships endures because it wasn't about destruction. It was about the loneliness of being right when no one believes you, and the discipline it takes to keep serving anyway. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of the attack, the Navy held a brief ceremony at the Submarine Force Museum in Groton. A bell rang 17 times. No speeches. No politicians. Only the low hum of veterans standing shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed, remembering the faces of men who had seen the impossible and refused to embellish it. When the final ring faded, a single sentence was read aloud from Ramage's original log. "Engaged enemy convoy. Results uncertain until verified." That line, once used to doubt him, had become his legacy, humility written in steel. Outside the museum, a child asked his grandfather, a retired sonar man, what it all meant. The old man smiled and said, "It means sometimes the truth takes the long way home." Today, the coordinates of that battle are marked on maritime charts as wreck sites, just anonymous dots on a blue field. Cargo ships pass over them daily, their crews unaware of what sleeps below. The Pacific covers it all as it always does, turning fire and fear into silence. But somewhere in that deep water lies proof that men can fight unseen, succeed uncelebrated, and still remain whole. The ocean doesn't hand out medals. It offers memory. And memory, like pressure, never disappears. It just settles deeper, waiting to be found. 80 years later, the night still speaks, though quietly. Not through reports or broadcasts, but through the soft echo that sonar picks up when a modern submarine passes near the coordinates of MI-11. A faint sound returns. Steady, rhythmic, impossible to place. It could be machinery. It could be the sea remembering 17 ships that once crossed this patch of water and never came back. Whatever it is, it hums long enough for the sonar man to pause, mark the position, and whisper what men like Ramage already knew. The ocean never lies. It just waits.